When making hair for IMVU using Blender, there are a number of considerations that we need to keep in mind. Primarily, there are differences between the female avatar and the male avatar. This means that when you're making your mesh, you need to take into account the positional differences between the female head and the male head. The second major problem, which is similar, is the positional relationship of the exported mesh to the avatar helper. So if we select the female helper, we can see that the hair is positioned relative to the head. So if we make a simple hairpiece, we use the avatar helper to position the hairpiece and make sure that it's shaped correctly. But on export, we have to do quite a bit of fiddling and adjustments to make sure that the mesh is correctly positioned in IMVU. In Blender, this translates to mean the mesh is positioned quite a distance away from the head. This is the only way to ensure that the hair mesh is correctly positioned in IMVU. So keep in mind the two main problems, the difference between the male and female head, and then the positional problems to make sure that the mesh works properly in IMVU. What this means is that if the hair accessory is exported from Blender correctly relative to the head and the armature, the result in IMVU is similar to this. And as we can see, although the hair rotates and moves and shifts with the head, it's positioned incorrectly. Whereas what we actually need is this. And this is done exporting the repositioned mesh relative to the head and the armature. Now, depending on the style of hair that's being made, it's often best to start the object from a cube as opposed to a sphere. This is primarily because of UV issues that are caused by the poles. That's this area at the top and the bottom of the sphere. These pole areas cause problems with UV maps. It also causes problems when editing the mesh because it's not as easy to do. We can show that by editing the cube that's already been added to the scene. In edit mode, make sure everything is selected and subdivide it. And then in mesh, transform to sphere. And this will give us a sliding. So if we slide it all the way, left click to confirm, that creates a sphere that at a later stage will be much easier to UV map. And from here what we can then do is simply just remove a number of surfaces. Just delete those faces. What we can then do is make the hair symmetrical, so select and remove one side of the mesh using area select, that's the B key, delete, go into object mode, so in the modifiers select mirror, go back into edit mode, and then what we can then do is shape the mesh by editing and changing vertices to provide the shape of the hairpiece. This is just a simple bob, but it can be any style. And you'll note that as we change the vertices or vertexes, the mirrored mesh changes also. And quite quickly you've already got the basic shape of a hairpiece. Trying the same thing using the sphere is slightly tricky because of these poles at the top. But what we can do, the same process again. remove an initial selection, delete, then again select half the mesh, remove, mirror, and as before just make some changes. Generally speaking, what we want to do is create a basic shape which can be molded around the head once we make that visible. Now once you're happy with the general shape of the mesh, it needs to be UV mapped. Now again, because of the design that you've chosen, the complexity of the UV map will be relative to that. But what makes hair tricky, which we'll see in a second, is that hair is generally linear. So you need to avoid unwrapping that goes against the grain as much as possible, or against the direction in which the hair naturally would fall. So the general principle of unwrapping is to keep the direction in which the hair falls and reduce the number of crossovers or intersections or general misshaping that occurs as a result of overlapping or split UV maps. So simply unwrap, creating an initial layout, assign your texture, if using a TGA, it's possible to use the alpha channel display so that you can see either or of the alpha channel, but in the 3D view it will always display the main texture. But this can be used to then decide how we chop up or seam mark the mesh for better distribution of the texture. So selecting a number of different surfaces which may need to be triangulated, that's Ctrl T, in order to expose the internal or the diagonal edge along which a seam can be placed. So what we can do is mark a number of edges as seams, UV seams, and unwrap again. That straightens it out slightly. There's another seam. If we then rotate that, we can see that that creates a much better distribution of the texture over the mesh to align with the direction in which the hair is going. So this is one of the reasons why we use UV seams in this way. Now if you're using an alpha channel and you want this kind of soft edge, it's just a question then of, in the UV editor, just changing the position of the UVs. And of course, because this is a linear striped texture, we can be quite aggressive with the layout of the UVs, because any distortion along the horizontal won't be noticeable as much as it would be if it were any other type of texture. So it's just a question of adjusting the UV vertices to adjust the UV map to get a reasonable unwrap of the entire mesh. So if we show the head, we can see that relatively quickly we've got a simple, straightforward hair mesh with soft edge. Design dependent again, one of the things that needs to be kept in mind is that the underside or backside typically of the head is not visible. This often means adding additional surfaces to the inside of the mesh which stretch towards the back of the head. This then disguises the fact that the back of the head isn't exposed at certain angles when looking at the avatar. So keep in mind that this is something that, whilst not required, may be necessary depending on the style that you've chosen. Again, this can be separately UV mapped. Taking advantage of any soft edges as required. And as we can see, relatively quickly we've got a completed and relatively simple hairpiece that should look decent enough from most angles. The avatar is viewed in IMVU. So once that's done, the mesh is basically created and UV mapped with the texture and material assigned. It's then just a question of exporting it. Before doing that, we need to prep the mesh. So that means applying the mirror modifier. So this becomes one single solid mesh. Double check that the vertices along the center seam all closed and collapsed. Whilst in edit mode, make sure everything is selected. In object data, create your vertex group. This is called head with a capital H. Assign. Double check that that's assigned to everything. Exit edit mode. Select the armature. Control P to parent using object. Select the mesh. In modifiers, add an armature, and then in the object, and select the armature which is to influence the mesh once the two have been linked up. In this case that's head female f.rig. That then means that if we select the armature and move it, the hairpiece moves. So at this point it's then just a question of selecting the mesh, the armature, file, export, Cal3D exporter, and remember that this needs to be activated from user preferences, add-ons, install it from the zip file that you should have downloaded, and then once installed it should show up in the list of options that are available, and then simply select to activate. So then export, Cal3D. All we need for this is the XMF and the XRF, the material. Select the two, change the file name if needed, and export. So it's a good idea, because this is an exported or prepped version, just save a version. And then assemble in IMVU. Hair has to be created in IMVU in the same way as any other product. This means that it has to be derived from an IMVU parent or base item. In this instance, that's the accessories. So loading up a hair accessory, we're then ready to assemble all the files we've just exported from Blender. So click add.xmf, select the mesh, apply changes, add the XRF, texture, and opacity map. And remember to set vertex colors and or blending depending on the look that you're after. With everything put together then, we can see that the mesh is too big and incorrectly positioned. So we have to go back into Blender and make some adjustments. First things to adjust is to unparent everything, keep transform, select the mesh, and we need to change the scale or fix it so that each of the X, Y and Z coordinates are 1, so Control A, rotation and scale, reparent that, object, and then re-export again. Back in IMVU, update. So what we have there is a mesh that's in the right place, but it's not being influenced properly by the head. And the only way to fix this is to manually edit the XMF file to change influence, which is the bone name over the mesh. So open the XMF file into Windows Notepad or similar text or code editor. In this instance we're using Notepad+. Selecting Influence ID 2, change that to Influence 22. So in your text editor, use a find and replace feature and just replace all. Close, save, and then re-upload. And again, although we have the influences set up correctly, so the head bone, which is the ID 22, is properly influencing the hair mesh, we still have the positional problem. So it's now just a question of going back into Blender, making various adjustments, repositioning the mesh relative to the default head template, and then re-exporting until we match the two together. So as mentioned, back in Blender, edit mode, select everything, and relative to how the mesh appears in IMVU, so observe where this line is and how far the hairpiece needs to be adjusted or moved forward or back, left or right, up or down relative to the head. So I need to adjust that about that amount. Re-export. We just need the mesh this time, so deselect XRF. Replace the mesh. – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – – adjust the influence. $22. Yes. Okay. Save. Replace the mesh again. And again we can see that we're almost there. So it's back into Blender, make some more adjustments and rinse and repeat until the position is correct. And then once you've done that, that's the hairpiece done in Blender for IMVU. It's just a question then of uploading to the catalogue and making it available as you see fit.